Well, welcome everybody to the 12th session of the International IVF Initiative, or I3. I'm honored and excited to be co-hosting this 12th session of the International IVF Initiative with Dean Morbeck. We are in the 6th week of our initiative. My name is Jacques Cohen, and I'm excited to introduce you to today's session, which is entitled Patient-Friendly and Minimal Approaches in Assisted Reproduction. An examination of whether we have been overcomplicating assisted reproduction, an important question. I'm joined by Dean Morbeck from New Zealand, and you can see his house in the background and his view. Dean is the Scientific Director at Fertility Associates in New Zealand, Sanford International Fertility Centre, and he's also an honorary lecturer at the University of Auckland. He oversees the science and laboratories in IVF clinics throughout New Zealand and Malaysia, and oversees, well, many cycles of IVF treatment. Dean, why don't you take it from here, and I'm going to just have a relaxing time.
All right, thanks, Jacques. Thanks for keeping that to a minimum. It's truly an honor to be hosting this very special session with you. Our speakers today are providers and product developers in the area of simplified assisted reproduction, home monitoring, direct-to-consumer diagnostics, and they represent industry, academia, and the clinical lab. Behind the scenes, we have our wonderful I3 team, including Thomas Elliott, Marianne Savice, Shaista Shadrudin, and Peter Naj. And we also have a technical team that manages all of your questions to feed them through to us so we can ask the speakers. And that includes Kelly Ketterson, Allison Bartolucci, and Giles Palmer. For any disclosures and bios of the speakers and moderators, please refer to the site www.ivfmeeting.com and look up the 12th session. A little housekeeping here is that please note that all questions to the speakers must be asked through the Q&A feature. Please do not use the chat function. Now, I know I've seen a lot of chats already lighting up down there. Don't use the chat function, use the Q&A feature. Because the panelists will not be responding to questions asked on the chat function. Submitted questions will be answered either verbally by the speakers or in writing by the panelists today or after the session. Answers will be posted on the website. In addition, please do not use the Q&A chat area for solicitation of any products or company. This session will be recorded and is later available via a link on our site. As a matter of disclosure, Jacques likes to disclose that he is on the Scientific Advisory Board of DADI. The work of that company will be presented in the third lecture by Tom Smith. We have 3 outstanding speakers today, and we are really lucky as they will be presenting what is really at the cutting edge of innovation, work that we hope will yield more accessible and affordable fertility treatment for our patients. We have Kevin Doody from Bedford in Texas, Professor Jan Gerris from Ghent University in Belgium, and Tom Smith from DADI in Brooklyn, New York. Jacques, why don't you go ahead and introduce the first speaker? Mute.
If I turn on the microphone. Thank you very much, Thomas, for pointing it out. It's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Kevin Doody, probably well known to all of you. He will give 2 short talks. The first one will be covering today's theme and will center around streamlining assisted reproduction and cost reduction. And at the end, he will come back and speak again about intravaginal culture and in vivo cell. Kevin has been an REI since 1989 and practices with his spouse, Dr. Kathy Doody, in North Texas. Their program is called CARE. Kevin is a leader and pioneer in art. He was one of the first to go routinely to plastic sculpture and was the president of SART. I think it was 2017 or 18. And before that, in SART, he was responsible for the excellent changes that were made to the South Course data system around 2014. So Kevin, it's a pleasure that you're joining us, and I'm looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you for the introduction, Jacques, and it's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I'm giving two talks, and the first will be a streamlining or a minimalist approach to in vitro fertilization. I do need to disclose that I make money providing IVF services, so I'm the owner of Care Fertility with my wife. I'm also on the board of directors and a shareholder of IN VIVO Bioscience, consultant and investigator for Ferring and investigator for Ohana Biosciences. This slide could have been either in the first or the second talk. It's really the intersection between streamlining and a minimalistic approach to IVF and vaginal culture. And it was interesting that when we first presented our data, it was reported not in a medical journal, but in The Economist, and then subsequently, after we published, that was reported also in The Atlantic. And I think this highlights that the general population and the lay press is interested both in saving money and in IVF in general. Now, the tendency for in vitro fertilization over the many years has been to optimize success rates. At the same time, that comes with cost. And over the last decade or longer, in medicine in general, there's been a tendency not just to look at optimal outcomes, but to look at the cost and to balance those. And so this publication in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2009 highlighted that going forward, a new strategy for healthcare needed to be considered, and that was really based on a value system, looking at both outcomes and cost. With respect to in vitro fertilization, this was a landmark publication by Georgiana Chambers and the International Committee for the Monitoring of Assisted Reproductive Technology, which aggregates data from all around the world, published about 6 years ago. And they looked at the per capita utilization of in vitro fertilization around the world and the affordability. And what they found was that ART affordability was independently and positively associated with ART utilization. And that on average, any 1% decrease in the percentage point of the ART with respect to disposable income was able to predict a 3.2% increase in utilization around the world. And this slide just shows in the developed world how affordable or non-affordable IVF is in different countries. On the very right, we see countries like Israel and the Netherlands, Iceland, Belgium, where the healthcare system in general takes care of assisted reproductive technology and the costs associated with it. That's not to say that it's free, but the government pays for it. Whereas as we go to the left on the x-axis, we see in the middle of the graph, we'll see the United States, the mandated states, so those 13 states within the U.S. in which there's some insurance coverage, provided that they're employed. And then on the very left, we see some of the countries that IVF is very unaffordable, such as Canada, Brazil, Mexico, typically not covered by insurance or the government. And then finally, the last bar on the left is where we practice in the US and in non-mandated states and Texas. So the cost of IVF as a percentage of the disposable income is quite high, and the per capita utilization is quite low. So why is it such a financial burden? Well, first, I think it's important to say that it's not because of greedy physicians, nurses, and embryologists. The cost relates to the complexity of IVF as it has evolved and as we practice it. Typically, there are multiple visits that require large administrative resources. There's a large facility and equipment expense, laboratory, and just the provision of medical care as we do it is quite expensive. So one thing that has been discussed as a means to decrease the cost is to think about alternative medications. So medications, as we know, contribute to a large part of the cost of an IVF cycle. So IVF can be done in a natural cycle. Obviously, Louise Brown, the first IVF live birth was done in a natural cycle. Within the SART registry, annually we report outcomes, and we have an ability to filter outcomes by the type of stimulation. And when we look at outcomes for natural cycles in the most recent reporting year, we can see that this is probably not a good value. So it may be low in terms of cost, but the live birth rate, even in the most favorable age category, the less than 35, is quite low. And in the older age category, in 229 patients that were above age 42, there were no live births. Contrast that with minimal stimulation, and clinics are allowed to define what they consider as minimal stimulation, but typically it's oral medicines such as clomiphene or letrozole with or without some amount of gonadotropins administered. And we see that this does improve the success rate significantly. In the less than 35, nearly a third of patients are achieving pregnancy. Still in the older age women, it's not very effective. In over 42, only 1% of patients achieved a live birth. It's important to know that this is the first transfer, and natural cycles or minimal stimulation, there's typically not an extra frozen embryo transfer, as opposed to conventional stimulations. We can see that this has the highest success rate. In the under 35, the first embryo transfer has approximately a 40% live birth rate. When one adds in the subsequent embryo transfers derived from that, the subsequent frozens, it exceeds at least 10% or so higher than that. Another factor to consider is the monitoring of IVF. And there are really two different approaches to monitoring. I would call it a US approach and a European approach. And the US approach is more complex. We generally will use a higher gonadotropin dosing. This translates directly to a higher medication expense. It also typically means that we have more intensive monitoring during the stimulation, not just multiple sonograms being performed, but typically in tandem with endocrine testing, estradiol, LH, progesterone, etc. In contrast, the European approach is less complex. And as a generalization, there's a lower gonadotropin dosing, which translates to a lower medication expense. And the monitoring is often primarily done with sonography rather than a combination of sonography and estradiol and other endocrine testing. Well, which approach is better? This has been the subject of a few different studies, and a systematic review of this issue was undertaken by Drs. Kwan, Bhattacharya, Kang, and Woolner, and published in the Cochrane Library in 2014. What they found was that in randomized controlled trials comparing transvaginal ultrasonography alone versus the sonography plus hormonal testing, there actually were no studies looking at live birth as an outcome, but there were 4 studies looking at clinical pregnancy rate. Total of 617 participants. There was no difference. The odds ratio was 1.05 with a fairly wide confidence interval. The mean number of eggs retrieved was also no different. There were 5 studies that looked at that, total of 595 participants. Cancellation rate was also no different, although a fewer number of studies and participants. And then finally, the complication of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, obviously a concern if we minimize the monitoring, did not appear to be any different. There were 6 studies and over 700 participants with a nearly identical odds ratio for the complication of ovarian hyperstimulation. So in summary, IVF treatment has evolved the way we practice it to be very complex and burdensome. This translates to a higher expense and therefore limits the availability of assisted reproductive technology to the population, limits access. And there's limited evidence that hormonal testing during the stimulation cycle is a benefit. And certainly many, if not most, cycles can be managed by ultrasonography alone without the need for serum estradiol and or progesterone in most cases. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. That's just a great introduction. And several questions are coming through. Maybe this is a good point for Jan Gerris to share his presentation, but we have a few questions for you, Kevin. What's striking in the SART course data from 2018 is this 11% of success rate that you see in the younger patients, the youngest group of patients after a natural cycle. I mean, it's strikingly low. I just wonder, why is that? What do we do wrong?
Yes, it does not seem to be much of an improvement over where we were 35 years ago, right?
Yes, so I mean, if you compare it to, so you didn't show that now, but if you look at implantation rates in the younger patients in the first attempt, it's 50.4%. For the first time, it's breached 50% this year, in this reporting year. I mean, that's almost 5 times higher than a natural cycle.
I think we have to remember that we're calculating success here based on cycle start, and many of these patients will ovulate and not actually go to a retrieval. They go to retrieval in a natural cycle. They may not get a mature egg. That egg may not fertilize, and so there's an attrition rate that's quite significant.
Yeah. Another striking figure that you show is the costs per country, and particularly mandated versus non-mandated states. For those of us who are calling in from the USA, what's the effect of national health payments? Because of course in the United States it's either the patient or the employer, directly or indirectly, pays for the treatments. But what's the effect in countries like the Netherlands and Belgium, where Jan is from? What's the effect there? I mean, it's not possible that they only pay 100 or 200 euros when you look at that graph. So
somebody's paying, the government's paying, but it certainly translates to a higher per capita utilization in those areas where the government is paying, and I've seen numbers 4 or 5-fold as high a per capita utilization in those places.
Right. Well, thank you again, and we'll come back to you later. Okay.
Thank you.
So it's my pleasure to introduce you to the next speaker, Professor Jan Gerris. He is currently practicing at Ghent University in Belgium. He graduated from Antwerp University in 1976 and became a registered specialist in gynecology in 1981. And a professor at the Free University of Brussels soon thereafter. He has been a full professor at Ghent University since 2007. Has been a chairman of various professional organizations, and among his many numerous accomplishments are the pioneering of single embryo transfer, which he was the leader, the originator, and one of the leaders, and of course telemedicine. He will speak about the latter, telemedicine, and home ultrasonography for follicular development. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you, Jacques, and hello to everybody around the world. I'm happy that you are all around, although I don't see you. My contribution to this webinar will be on telemedicine and home ultrasonography of follicular development. I work in Ghent and I have no conflicts of interest. As a focus for simplification for patients, we have been studying over the last 10 years the possibility to replace the need for frequent sonograms in the hospital by home sonography. And the second point about frequent serum E2 determinations will not be treated in this webinar. What is the rationale to introduce home sonography? The rationale is that there is a lot of stress involved with the actual way we conduct our monitoring. The patient is certainly in the center of the treatment, but she has to come many times to the center or to the care provider, introducing a lot of stress for those who are doing these sonographies, usually in the morning, stress for the patients, for her partner. And you will see there is a very short video that is shown to the patients in a longer version just prior to starting the treatment, so that they can that they are well prepared about how the system works. Yes, here you have to click on demo. SUT is an acronym and stands for Self-Operated Endovaginal Telemonitoring. It's a system that allows women to make themselves at home or wherever they want, when Wi-Fi is available, their own vaginal sonograms. We also teach the women how to handle the probe. It is easy, it is painless, the technique does not hold any risks.
Now you're ready to start the sonogram. So start with the right ovary. Position the probe and observe the follicles by pushing the end of the probe to the left. When you push the button, the recording starts. Next, you can move on to the uterus. You enter the probe straight into the vagina and press the button again when you're ready to record. The record icon runs again. When you push one last time, you have the option to type a message and send it to your doctor. When you press finish, the message is ready to be sent. The video will be sent automatically. Here you see the blue arrow indicating that the transmission of the recording is ongoing. When the green check mark appears, this means that the video has been delivered to your care provider. If you click here, you can read the response of your care provider.
So using this system, we have conducted a randomized controlled trial comparing about 60 SUT cycles with 60 non-SUT cycles, and the number of mature oocytes was exactly the same also after logarithmic transformation in both groups. Next slide. Next slide, please. Shows you that the result in terms of cumulative HCG and ongoing pregnancies was exactly the same. We also looked at patient-reported variables, comparing SUT versus non-SUT of patients participating in the study. And as you can see, satisfaction of the patient and her partner was highly significant in the favor of SUT, empowerment as well, participation of the partner, and discretion as well. The stress was not really significant because there was also an element of stress of participation to a study using a completely new technology. But when we compared those patients who participated to the study and who had already one SUT cycle previously, then all the differences were highly significant. And now the next slide will show you in the Belgian system, that does not necessarily compare to the United States, but there was the cost of a non-SUT cycle was approximately double as a cost of the SUT cycle. This is excluding biology, laboratory, and gonadotropins, of course, but it shows you the follicular phase to be that SUT is for the follicular phase a cost-saving strategy. Next slide. Some patient commentaries. It's a great gain of time and life quality. Our lives are less dominated by IVF. Discretion and ease of use are awesome because the SUT recordings can be done anywhere, anytime. There is great appreciation for the technology, but even more so for the personalized and swift communication. There was a feeling of very close follow-up, and most patients, once they had used the system, requested to use it again in subsequent attempts. Next slide. So the teaching consists of one session of about 40 minutes. In the preliminary, we asked to look at the instruction video, which you just saw in an abbreviated version. Then we create a new cycle and new patient. That's a technical point. But at the start of treatment, using a normal echographic machine, we show the patient usually with half full bladder, only for the demo, the uterus, the arteria and vena iliaca interna, the resting ovaries. We show them the fixed recording sequence, 30 seconds right ovary, 15 seconds uterus, 30 seconds left ovary. We ask them to focus on the largest follicles in two perpendicular largest diameters to start the recording. And of course, this is told now very briefly, but when you take about 10-15 minutes, you can nicely explain the patients how to recognize their structures. We always tell them that SUT is a tool and not a goal. So we usually keep a backup possibility possible. We ask the first phonogram after 7 days at the earliest, because before that the follicles are small and patients tend not to see them all. So the rule of thumb is that if there was no reliable recording on day 12 of the stimulation, we ask the patient to come to the center. And in 90% of these 100 cycles, there was no visit between the start and the oocyte retrieval. In 9%, patients had to come because they had a very slow or very poor response, and we confirmed it. And 1% was through failure. There were no adverse effects or events. There were some OHSS cycles in which all freeze was applied and 3 patients got pregnant. Patients and partners were highly satisfied and almost all requested to use the system again. And in these 100 cycles subsequent to the randomized trial, the average savings in transportation amounted to €600. Next slide. There are some impediments which have made it difficult to implement the system more widely now. And the first is that there is no reimbursement. Patients have to be physically present, at least in Belgium and in many countries, in order to be able to charge. The second is that patients are very positive, but physicians are more reluctant because they are paid by the sonogram, and unless point 1 is solved, they are interested but do not want to apply it. So we have to work on that, and that's being done. Technical improvements to the system are possible, but require investments, and it will be an example of experience economy, if you will. The next slide. Then we go slowly to conclusions. So in the future, time that midwives and nurses now have to put into frequent sonograms, explaining to patients what to do and so on, can be used for other tasks. Physicians can use their time to see new patients. A bundled billing of the whole ovarian cycle stimulation by fixed amount payment is possible, and it will also be more eco-friendly. And finally, next slide. We can say that the principle of home telemonitoring is appreciated certainly by selected patients and probably feasible by about 10 to 30% of all patients, but it is insufficiently known nor valued by physicians and insurers, and it could be a solution for barriers of distance and time and for limitations of access to ART. And of course, we will need more clinical experience in several countries to get more experience. I thank you very much. And I'm sorry for the technical hiccups.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you for battling through that. It was fascinating presentation. I will just say I've added my headphones because my laptop does the same thing yours did, which is occasionally just mutes itself randomly, and I don't understand why.
Yeah.
So thank you for battling through. And really fascinating work. I've been following your work since getting to New Zealand, because here we've got 5 clinics that are spread out. You know, they're at the larger cities. But we have many people who live out in the remote sites who are growing the grapes to make the fantastic New Zealand wines that we have, as well as, you know, farmers who are raising the free-range cattle and sheep that we're so famous for. So the question that I have first is how soon will this be commercially available?
Well, Dean, it's difficult to say. The company that has been manufacturing and with which I have been working is a small company, but at this moment I'm sure that the whole COVID-19 situation is in it for some reason. There are plans to make it available also in the American markets. But it's a bit early to say exactly when, but we hope very soon.
Okay. There's a number of questions. I can't get to them all right now, but one from Ramalakshmi asking, are the patients able to localize the ovaries all the time? So like what percentage of patients, that, we know ovaries can be tucked up high. How often does it happen that they can't actually see it?
Well, I showed that in one of those slides. If you take 100 random cycles, uninterrupted series of 100 cycles, there was actually only one patient who failed to visualize up to the 12th day of stimulation 4 follicles that were in place. So she was a poor responder, but she had 4 nice follicles and she missed them. That's the only patient out of 78 patients having a total of 100 attempts. So it's really rare, but I have to say that there is some patient selection. This is a new technique and it's the most savvy women, the most busy women, often women who already have a child and who live at a certain distance who are most willing to give it a try. But most women that I've used it in, when I ask them, do you think you are able to introduce a vaginal probe into the vagina, just had a laugh at me, and say, what do you think? I'm not able to do that. And of course, you have to show them where the arteria and vena iliaca are, to show them the outline of the grape-like figure of the ovaries, but it works out very nicely, especially once the follicles are larger than 12 millimeters. Patients tend to remember what the position was. They had to have the probe, and they can actually use it as many times as they want. They don't have to send each time the sonogram. They can kind of exercise at home alone or with their husband, and it goes very well.
Good. Thank you, Jan. That sounds very promising. I'd like to take this time now to move on and first ask Tom to go ahead and share your screen. And then I'll go ahead and introduce you. So Tom Smith is the CEO and co-founder of Daddy, a good acronym, is an entrepreneur whose work includes growing and selling 2 software companies. Tom was a member of Apple's first iPhone team. Most recently, he was the co-head of product at media company Giphy. Tom is a board member of Canopy Foods. Along with being a co-founder of Daddy, Tom is responsible for the growth and development of the organization and its employees. Tom is a Toronto-based native, now living in Brooklyn. He graduated from the London School of Economics in 2009 in managerial economics and strategy. Tom, let's hear it.
Thank you so much, Dean. It's really a pleasure to be here. This summit itself has such great talks that it just feels like a privilege. So I thank you for that. First, to disclose, as you said in the bio, I am not a doctor. I didn't go to medical school, but I truly think that that kind of fresh perspective brings something new to the space that we'll obviously talk about today. So the topic of the talk is at-home sperm collection, the future of semen analysis, sperm storage, and male factor diagnostic services. So let's jump in. Okay, so our mission at Daddy is to normalize the conversation around male reproductive health. Male is the key word there. The problem, so what got us motivated in this industry, is that few men think about or understand their reproductive health. Male sperm counts have declined more than 50% over the last 40 years due to lifestyle and environmental factors. And today, 1 in 6 couples can expect incidents of infertility. And that means that 1 in 6 couples after a year of trying were unable to conceive or to fertilize. Of known cases of infertility, 50% of those can be attributed to the man. And male factor infertility is often overlooked or diagnosed after their female partner. One piece of clarification on the 50% statistic is in actuality, it's 1/3 of cases are female factor related, 1/3 are male factor related, and 1/3 are either jointly or unknown. So of known cases, it's 50% female and 50% male factor. And the final problem was that sperm storage as an industry, sperm banking, is really stuck in the 1980s and does not offer any convenient or affordable approaches. So what's the solution? By detecting male factor defects early, men and couples can be directed to the right treatment plans, thus saving them time, money, and unnecessary stressful procedures. When creating our service, we focused on an aspect that's 10 times more affordable, easy to complete at home, and uses our patented technology to ensure the deposit is handled safely in transport. We believe that empowering men with the knowledge and information on their fertility allows them to be a more active participant in family planning and discussions with their partner. So, how does at-home collection work? There's 3 steps. The first step is you order a kit. Our temperature control kit is discreetly delivered to the customer's home, where in their privacy they're able to collect. After they collect into the cup, they actually hit a button on the top of the lid, which releases a preservative, an extender, that allows it to stay safe for the journey back to the lab. And the kit itself creates the thermal environment designed for that mixture of that media and that semen together. Step 2 is after the kit arrives at our lab, within 24 hours of handing your kit to FedEx, that customer will receive their fertility report. We measure the sperm count, motility, volume, and pre-freeze motile sperm of every deposit that we collect. We also include a video of their sperm that we also attach to the customer's fertility report. It's worth noting that we generate both a simplistic and a detailed fertility report. The simplistic report is designed to communicate the information simply to the customer, and we often compare their results against the World Health Organization 5th edition to give them a relative score. The third and final step is that after the deposit is prepared and processed, we prepare it for long-term storage. And healthy deposits are stored on an annual subscription basis, giving customers a low-cost, long-term option to store. It's also worth noting that in every package that we sell, we also give a year of free storage. And during that 1-year period, that allows that individual to make a choice whether to see if long-term storage is right for them. The reason we give them a year is ultimately, given the sensitivity of what we're collecting and storing, we had instances in our early testing where an individual would send a kit in, get the results, ultimately want to store, but that deposit had previously been disposed of. So in the interest of giving people a lot of latitude, we give them a full year of free storage. Okay, what are the advantages to at-home collection? So really, our reach is limited to that of the FedEx network. You know, in many cases, individuals that live in major cities in the US, and as a caveat, this is a very US focused presentation, but many of these themes do apply internationally. They don't actually have access to a lot of fertility services or preservation services. Given the fact that FedEx operates and covers plus 95% of all 50 states, this really allows us to be able to service a much broader group of individuals along with the major cities. On the map on the right-hand side, what you'll see is that in 2019, we serviced 1,100 unique cities. And for us, that really demonstrates the fact that this is a systemic need. And in virtually all our cases, the distribution of individuals was spread evenly amongst the population of the country, which is also very interesting, which again signals to us that this is systemic. Technology. For us, a well-designed kit is one that allows for collection in any environment. Sperm is fairly robust, and there are instances where if you collect into a plastic cup, throw it into a cardboard box and put it in the mail, if it arrived at the facility, it could be viable enough to store. But when designing something that's trying to address a much broader audience, what's important in this situation is to make sure that it can handle all thermal environments. On the right-hand side, what we've tried to show here, and much of our testing at the stage of business that we're in is fairly proprietary, But what I wanted to demonstrate here was the way in which we try to test and understand the viability of our kits. You know, what you'll see in these graphs is on the y-axis, you'll see temperature, and on the x-axis, you're actually going to see time. And what we're looking for is where that blue line's the payload temperature, the mixture of the media and the semen, reaching that inflection point, reaching that hockey stick curve. And where that hockey stick curve actually crosses over our thermal limit lines is where we know that the failure point takes place. And ultimately, the kit that we've developed is designed to be able to handle winter in New Jersey along with the summer in Texas. Cost and speed. For us, we took a hard look when first designing the service at the existing industry. And what we saw was that in many cases, to test and store your sperm costs thousands of dollars. When reviewing it from a first principles basis on cost and price, what you actually determine is that the costs are not prohibitive. You know, much of the cost infrastructure that exists in the current industry is really designed around supporting administrative services. And by stripping those out and streamlining our process for at-home collection to the lab, we were able to reduce our cost profile significantly. So what's included in our offering is for $199, you get the at-home kit, all of the materials necessary for the overnight shipping both ways, a lab-tested fertility report, and a year of free storage, all for $199. And the final point, and this one's a lot more subtle, but I think important to raise in this environment, is we also believe that we should be rewarding customer courage with speed. And what I mean by that is when you think about, or said differently, ignorance is bliss. And there are many men all over the country whose ejaculate and volume of ejaculate is completely normal. Yet people in this audience understand that when you look into a microscope, you actually might see no sperm at all. For individuals that are being proactive about their fertility and ultimately exposing themselves to a certain amount of bad news, we try to honor that experience with a 24-hour turnaround. Typically, when you look at STD testing and other types of testing, it's a week. And we didn't want our customers sitting on pins and needles throughout that entire process. So speed was an important part of this whole process for us. Okay, that's the current state today. What I want to talk about next is the future. And really, the future for us involves our second kit, which we're actually going to be announcing and releasing in 2 weeks. So for us, the second kit is really around pace of innovation. You know, when you look at this industry, hasn't been a lot of innovation since the 1980s. And what we want to really represent in this space is this constant pace of innovation. In 1 year, we launched our service in January 2019. We spent the entire year actively reviewing our process. We talked to our medical board of advisors, the lab, our industrial design team, and many, many customers. And what we ultimately determined was there was a big opportunity to improve this service, specifically around security and performance. I'll go through those now. So starting with security. When you think about the contents of what you're actually sending, what we said to ourselves in the development process is this: for a lot of customers, this might be the weirdest thing or the strangest thing they'll ever mail. And in addition to that, it's actually one of the most important things that they'll ever mail, because ultimately it could be the factor that leads to them being able to have a child. And when mailing something like that in, you introduce a certain amount of risk in that handoff. So what we really wanted to focus on with the second kit was security. What you'll see on the right-hand side are two images. The first is the bottom of our cup, and the second is on the outside of the kit. What we do for all of our cups is we custom laser etch a QR code and 9-digit code in the bottom of that cup, which the customer uses to register their kit when it first arrives. We also layer in a security band inside the kit with a custom barcode. That barcode and cup at our fulfillment center is linked in our proprietary ERP system. After the customer collects, they loop the security band on the outside and clip it shut. That tamper-proof seal ensures that no one can actively enter into that kit in the journey back. When the kit arrives at our lab, we scan both the security band and the bottom of the cup and wait for our system to validate that those were linked at the initial fulfillment. You know, two-factor authentication powered through an ERP is what we believe that should be the standard in this industry, especially given the fact that, you know, what you're sending is so important. Improved technology. You know, there's always going to be loss of sperm in transport, as we discussed earlier. Its motility typically in this industry is decreased by 10 to 15% in transport, given the time. It's too early for us right now to be able to publicly model and demonstrate the effectiveness of this kit, but I will say that, and we do plan on releasing a report later on this year, but we do have high hopes that the technological infrastructure of the components that we built into this kit will allow for more sperm to be stored. And ultimately, a superior kit means more healthy sperm stored. The other key aspect to the improvements on the technological side is we've actually developed a process where no refrigeration is needed, which ultimately improves the customer experience. Diagnostic. You might notice that in the initial part of the presentation, when I was outlining what was involved in the fertility report, there was no mention of morphology. And that's because morphology in the US specifically, when added to a fertility report, changes the classification of that report from a fertility report to a diagnostic. Diagnostics, depending on the state, need either a physician to be involved or not involved. When a physician is needed to be involved, that is when it is not a direct access testing state. In a DAT state, there is no physician necessary. So an example being in New York, for example, where I'm located now, it's a DAT state with no physician needed. In Texas, a physician is needed in actually placing the order for that diagnostic. What we've done in the second generation kit, we've actually partnered with Win Fertility, a large infertility benefits platform and a fantastic partner, to both help us with the physician approval for national diagnostic coverage and perform diagnostic services and 24-hour nursing support for any customer who orders the Daddy kit. And ultimately, what we believe that this has done is created a complete end-to-end service from full diagnostic testing to support through diagnostic and long-term support and care around optionalities with IVF. The final piece that I just want to highlight here around this new kit and what we believe to be a real statement of innovation is really trying to future-proof our service. At Daddy, every deposit is divided into 3 vials, which, against the current industry, is fairly atypical. From what we understand that exists in all the data that we've seen is ultimately after deposits collected, spun down, and then the sperm is pelletized, it's often resuspended and then aliquoted into a certain number of vials depending on the volume, typically landing in 1 or 2 vials. We divide every deposit into 3 vials because for us, we have to think both about the individuals that want to use their deposits in the short term, but those who want to store for the long term and what the technological environment will be in 10 years. When we look at those technical vectors, what we see is that IVF, especially around ICSI, is starting to increase and climb significantly, and the amount of costs in IVF is going down. And it's our future belief that less sperm will be necessary in actually completing these processes. By dividing every deposit into 3 vials, we give every customer the opportunity to have 3 opportunities to fertilize from a single collected deposit. If 2 kits are ordered, that's 6 vials, but in each case, it's 3 vials for each individual collection. So in conclusion, our mission at Daddy, and we're a fairly new company and very excited to be engaging with this whole industry, but our mission at Daddy is to normalize the conversation around male reproductive health. We believe that the future of male factor infertility services should be safe, convenient, and affordable, and ultimately that starts with at-home collection in many instances. I do want to say that, given that we are a new organization, we are beginning to ramp up our overall operations, but what we're beginning to identify is that the customer traction that we've been getting has started to lead to us actually having very compelling data in this space. And when you look at a lot of the research reports out there, what you notice is the sample of individuals in these research reports are fairly limited due to the cost of actually donors and the operational process. So I just like with this forum to really invite anybody in the industry who's interested in running more research to please get in touch. We have the opportunity to engage with many customers from all over the country in many, many ages, and dynamically ask a number of different questions to help support a research report. Ultimately, everything is anonymized and privacy is the #1 priority, but that is something that we are very interested in giving back with the industry. So my email is here located at the bottom, tom@daddykit.com, and I look forward to speaking with any of you. Thanks a lot, Dean.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. And welcome to the field. And thank you for bringing some much needed innovation here. We have a lot of questions. You really stimulated a lot of interest. Let me get my screen up. I'd like to just first ask though, I've had it before where, and this happens rarely, where unfortunately, you know, the guys don't get tested as early as they should. So your service will help with that. And sometimes we even get to the point, I've had it happen where I go to do an IUI and I have to actually talk to the patient the day of an IUI to say there's no sperm because they never had a semen analysis.
Right.
This raises the question of, you know, how sensitive and really, you know, just devastating news it is to find out that you're azospermic. What's been your experience when you've had patients that results have been azospermic?
Yeah, it's a great point. And actually, it was a tremendous learning for us when we first launched the service. Ultimately, our initial approach was one of really towing the industry line and making sure that we weren't stepping into that diagnostic area. So ultimately, what we commonly did was explain that there are many factors that go into every collection, and one specific collection doesn't necessarily dictate your level of fertility. But we often ask them to print out the report and speak to their primary medical provider and get a proper diagnostic. With this new partnership and us adding to the capability, we will have trained medical professionals on staff, 24 hours accessible, to talk through both that simplistic report and the heavily detailed report that is now being processed.
Great. Okay, well, let's cut to some of the other questions. Charlene Aloof has asked, how do you know that the sample is really that of the intended father or partner and not just a random man of interest? So you have good security around the shipping, but what about proof of that sample going into the kit?
No, it's a fantastic point. I mean, ultimately, the proof of going into the kit is an ultimate question. That's never going to be something other than if someone photographs themselves at home doing it, which we would never request. You know, one thing that we do to also protect this whole system is what we do in the disposal process and the retrieval process. So, you know, it's very typical in this industry to get notarized forms written from doctors and physicians to request use of the deposit. We actually go a step further and we ask all of our customers to go onto a digital notary, which we actually pay for cost on, to then walk through the steps so that they're actually on camera. It can be accessed through their phone or on their computer. It only takes about 2 minutes, but we added a few extra security steps to ensure that what's actually taking place is taking place.
So are you able to definitely identify the individual to say, is there some, like, I mean, it's their social security number is the thing that we have for sure, but their driver's license, some way to say that's absolutely that person and not some doppelganger that somebody, you know, pulled in to allow them to use somebody else's sperm?
Yeah, so in the digital notary process, what you actually do is you hold up your ID and then fill out a form. That service uses a number of ML training processes to actually identify and see if it's a fake ID or not, and then propose that data. Ultimately, it's significantly more safe and reliable than a physical notary, which you have no connection with. So in this space, we are trying to continually evolve this process and build in as many, you know, protection as possible. But it is worth noting that all deposits that we send back don't go to individuals. They always go to a physician specifically. And that's another kind of barrier to make sure that who's actually requesting it is getting their deposit.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again. That was fantastic. And we look forward to seeing how this evolves. Kevin, you're loading your screen. So it's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Doody again. I got to know Kevin when I served on the SART committee the year after I think he was the president. Kevin has truly been a pioneer in our field. You all should know that he and his team published the first report of a clinic performing 100% blastocyst transfers all the way back around 2000. Man, Kevin, we're getting old. Have you been able to share that screen? Are you good?
I'm good. Does it look good?
Excellent. Yes, got it.
Okay. So yes, thank you for that introduction. And next we'll be talking about in vivo development. Oops. So as we all know, IVF in the laboratory has evolved to be quite complex. And obviously Jacques is here, one of our experts with regard to what's required for clean air. so the embryology laboratory has to have a really dedicated HVAC infrastructure, which is quite expensive to build and to maintain because embryos do not have any liver, kidney, or lung to filter out the contaminants in the air. IVF has also evolved to incorporate a lot of micromanipulation techniques. In the US, about 80% of ART cycles now incorporate ICSI, and an increasing number incorporate pre-implantation genetic testing. This frequently requires the expense of a laser and a highly skilled human resource component. Additionally, our incubators are relatively expensive electromechanical devices, and as electromechanical devices can do, they can falter, and so they require daily quality control checks by gas analyzers, which themselves require calibration, daily temperature checks. All this needs to be recorded and documented. Of course, because of catastrophic failure, there must be a 24/7 alarming and a human resource to respond to that alarm, and a backup power source. So this is IVF as we practice it today. Now, about 30 years ago, IVF was a little bit different, and Claude Renew is really the genius behind this, and he developed a technique for fertilizing and developing embryos in the laboratory, and it was really a happenstance event. So as he tells it, as he describes it, it was a necessity being the mother of invention. They had just done an egg retrieval at their laboratory in France. The weather was such that a thunderstorm caused a power outage, and at that time there was no backup power source for their incubator. Being inventive, he got a flashlight. They had prepped the sperm and they had obtained the eggs already, so he combined them into a cryovial, and he placed that cryovial wrapped in some parafilm into the woman's vagina, hoping that the power would come back on within a few minutes or an hour or so, and it did not. But a couple of days later, it did come back on, and they brought her back into the laboratory. They removed the cryovial from her vagina, and lo and behold, there had been some eggs that had fertilized and had developed into embryos, and that began his investigation as a simpler way to achieve fertilization and embryo development in human embryos. However, and there were several studies that were done over the next decade using improvised devices. However, these studies, although they did find success, there were problems in terms of contamination from the media from the vaginal bacteria, sometimes the difficulty to identify eggs, sometimes the eggs and embryos had dried out because of air bubbles, and that led ultimately to his design and development of an intravaginal culture-specific device, something that is non-improvised but designed to achieve the fertilization and embryo development in the vagina. And we can see it here on the screen. It is really two components, the inner component being the incubator component and the outer shell simply existing to keep the inner component sterile. Now, it's made of plastic, and all plastics have certain properties to them. One property is that they are pretty good at containing aqueous fluids, but they do allow diffusion of gas, and that diffusion of gas depends on the type of plastics that's used. And you can see there are several different plastics that I've listed here in the slide, and they all have their different physical properties. What they chose to use was this one, polystyrene, and it has the property that has excellent optical clarity, but it also has a property that it has a very high diffusion rate of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And this is quite important because obviously our laboratory incubators are designed to mimic the reproductive tract partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide, low dioxide, low O2 and high CO2 to maintain the right oxygen tension and correct pH. And this particular material does that. For those of you that aren't familiar with the device, this is a internal chamber view from the top. we can see that the top has a little cap. When rotated, exposes the inside of the inner chamber so that it can be loaded with media, and in the case how we use it, with oil, eggs, and sperm. And this device was first reported in clinical use by Elkin Lucena out of Columbia in 2012. And he published it as an alternative treatment option for infertile couples with a minimally invasive IVF. They did do a minimal, what would be described as a minimal stimulation in 125 cycles. In this case, the sperm, approximately 35 to 50,000, were placed into the device with the eggs. And this was a 72-hour fertilization and embryo culture time frame. And this table demonstrates the outcomes stratified by age. And we can see that most of the cycles were done in women in their 30s, with relatively fewer under age 30 or over age 40. They did transfer relatively high numbers of embryos, as would be compared to with an extended embryo culture. But their pregnancy rates per cycle start were actually fairly high, nearly 60% in the lowest age group and approximately 1 out of 6 in the oldest age group. So this was interesting to us, although as was suggested, we have not done any cleavage stage culture in our laboratory for 22 years. Since 1998, we've been doing extended embryo culture. And we wanted to look at the use of this device in conjunction with a streamlined monitoring and stimulation protocol. We published this in April of 2016, where we compared the conventional laboratory incubators to the InvoCell device using a very streamlined stimulation procedure. Now, it's important to say that we cherry-picked these patients. We were trying to determine whether the device itself was capable of extended culture. So these were young women, 38 or less. They had normal ovarian reserve, no anatomical issues, and the male had to have either normal sperm or just mildly abnormal sperm. Our monitoring protocol was also simplified. We did no hormonal testing. There was a sonogram. We used a downregulation protocol initially, so we did a sonogram prior to starting the GnRH agonist, one sonogram prior to starting the gonadotropins, and then one on the after 9 doses of gonadotropins. So this was a cycle that was done on a Monday through Friday basis. The sonogram prior to gonadotropin start was done on a Friday. They started their gonadotropins on a Saturday. On the 10th day, the following Monday, they had their sonogram that would determine their day of trigger. And we only allowed the trigger to be on the 10th, 11th, or 12th day of stimulation only. No additional sonograms were done. The patients were then randomized either to the intravaginal culture or to the in vitro fertilization traditional electromechanical incubators in the laboratory. We did a short co-incubation of sperm and eggs. We did use an oil overlay, a single-step media. And at that time, we were only putting 10 eggs into the device at any one time, and then we transferred either 1 or 2 embryos, depending upon the patient's desire. And these were the pregnancy outcomes per cycle start for the first embryo transfer. And we can see there was no difference in the success rates. The positive HCG level was 70% in both treatment arms. The clinical pregnancy rate was identical at 65%. The live birth rate was 55% in the InvoCell arm and 60% with the traditional laboratory incubators. When we looked at actual numbers of babies, they were quite similar, with 16 babies being born in the intravaginal culture arm compared to 15 in the electromechanical incubators. So obviously there are potential disadvantages of intravaginal culture. So you don't get to look at many of your key performance indicators, including the fertilization rate, 2PN rate, can't detect polyploidy, et cetera. But there are potential advantages as well. One thing that we noted was that the best embryos tended to be more advanced in the intravaginal culture. We were seeing not infrequently fully hatched 6AA blastocysts on day 5 in these non-zona manipulated embryos, and that's something we really don't see with our traditional incubators. And we think this is related to the physiologic fluctuations in temperature that occur on a diurnal basis related to activity in mammals, and the change in temperature that occurs with progesterone production by the corpus luteum. And these are temperature changes that are not mimicked by our current laboratory incubator systems. So our current protocol is that we inseminate the eggs right at egg retrieval. We co-incubate the sperm and the eggs together for 5 minutes. We rinse them off. We don't try to avoid putting excess sperm into the in vivo cell device to minimize the metabolism of nutrients and the production of metabolic waste. This immediate loading of the inseminated eggs into the device at the time of retrieval also allows for a tremendous benefit to workflow. It's kind of do it and forget about it for 5 days. And so our ultimate conclusion with vaginal culture is that it's been safe and well tolerated. It allows for extended embryo culture without the need for expensive air handling systems, alarm systems, etc. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Another great presentation. We have a bunch of questions here, and before we go and open it up to the entire panel, just wondering, Kevin, you say there's a short co-incubation of sperm and eggs. What's short? How long is short?
So that's a real good question. So I wanted to know how short we could do it, and I did find a paper that was done in Denmark in 2004 in which they compared a 30-second incubation with their conventional 90-minute incubation, and they saw no difference in their fertilization rate. We've not been so brave, so we do a 5-minute exposure of the sperm and egg, which seems to be adequate, but it could be that it could be considerably less than that.
Yeah, now 5 minutes is great. I mean, you're waiting for somebody to fill in the form, and that's it, really.
Yeah, right.
You really turn it around. So, do you ever use ICSI in combination with the?
So some people do use ICSI. We don't. We don't think it fits in with our system of the streamlined offering. So we're offering our quote effortless IVF, as we call it, for in a same way every time. And so we don't think it's suitable for ICSI so well. We don't think it's so suitable for pre-implantation genetic testing because embryos require biopsy at different times. And I don't like doing ICSI without being able to monitor the kill rate of the eggs and the fertilization rate for those performance indicators.
So you just mentioned fertilization rate, and I just wonder, one of the worst things we always had to do before we started using ICSI more and more was mentioning that there was a complete fertilization failure to a patient where you expected normal fertilization from IVF. So so what is the proportion of patients who have that using this system? Is it 1%, 5%?
Yeah, so in our initial trial, we were lucky. In the first 20 patients, we had no complete fertilization failures, but we were fairly strict with regard to their ovarian reserve criteria. So we didn't have, we had very few patients with very low egg numbers. Obviously, you're more likely to have fertilization failures if you have only 2 or 3 eggs, or if there's significant sperm problems. But we do see it. But we see it in our conventional IVF as well. And we don't, even with our conventional approach, we don't do ICSI unless we have either prior failed fertilization or a significant abnormality on the semen analysis.
Yeah. Well, Dean, go ahead and let's open this up for.
I have a
looking
question
at this
for.
daunting list of questions right here.
I know.
Yeah. So,
I'd like to just actually take a little twist on this and focus on the stimulation and the trigger. So both for Kevin and Jan, both approaches you're taking seems to, it does it reduces the control, the really strictness we have around the trigger day, because we have less information. And I know, there's work from Kelton Tramelin, and we actually use it in one of our clinics to allow for more flexibility around triggering. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a compromise, or is there an actual?
So I don't think it is a compromise, really. So we do a lot of things in ART, as you know, by voodoo, and we do it because, yes, we like to control things, and we think that by doing little micro manipulations and by monitoring things that we can improve outcomes. But there is no data that shows that that these manipulations that we do actually improve outcomes. And we have an arbitrary size of a follicle at which we say it's mature, and that's arbitrary. The chronology of the stimulation is probably more important, the number of days of exposure to gonadotropins, than the size. And we've always found that if we have to extend the stimulation beyond 12 days, then those patients tend to have a poor outcome no matter what. If their follicle dynamics is such that their follicle growth rate is slow, there's something going on with the patients.
Well, we have another question from the panel. Mike Reed has a question about, have you cultured these devices in vitro as a form of device control?
So yes, we have. And I did not discuss at all our preliminary study. So we didn't jump right in to 5-day culture with embryos, because 5-day culture of the embryos, because it's not so simple as just taking the prior technique and letting it go a couple more days. We had to do some tweaks to it. And so we did things like 5-day sperm survival of these devices, both in the vagina and in our benchtop incubators, to see until we could get the tweaks to make it work.
Great. And there's questions around, let's see. Yeah, so you mentioned, I saw on your slide, you haven't seen any triploid or polyspermic, but do you know, how do you?
Well, we don't check for that. And one thing that and that's always been a criticism of, it doesn't lend itself to take it out 16, 18 hours after you put it in and then reload it and put it back in. You can't do that practically. So there are some fertilized eggs that will be developing into some embryos. And one thing that we found lacking in the literature was, how common is it that the 3PNs that we see with IVF actually become embryos that you're going to transfer? And it's actually relatively uncommon. We started to culture separately our 3PNs, that we're identifying in our conventional IVF, and they do sometimes develop into good embryos, but it's not common.
Tom,
one more here. I see one from Mustafa Tanzu. Any devices falling out during intravaginal culture? That would be one that we're of course interested in.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and I overlooked talking about that. So there's a little retention diaphragm that the device is placed into, and that this is inserted into the vagina. So we've not had any fallout. No.
Okay. That makes us feel a little better, that retention diaphragm.
Yeah. It's probably not necessary in a nulliparous patient, but if a patient has had a vaginal delivery before, I certainly would encourage the use of it.
Great. Say, Tom, we're having a lot of questions about the assuring viability of the sperm. And I know from my time at Mayo Clinic, we did a lot of semen analysis, reference semen analysis. So I always got the question too. So I know this is commonly asked because we have this WHO standard that says you have to test within an hour. You can't test within an hour. What's your answer to that question when you say, well, the WHO standard says to do a semen analysis, you need to do it within an hour?
I think although we are, I think, the organization that's really productizing this at-home collection process, many organizations have done their own version of at-home collection in the past. So this isn't something that I would say that, Daddy as an organization invented. Really, we've just taken that same idea and practice and tried to elevate it and modernize the process. So in response, I would say that every day we process many deposits that do come in with viable pre-freeze modal. And actually, one thing that's really exciting for us, and the thing that actually gets us the most motivated, is the fact that in this year we are expecting our first daddy baby. So we do know that this ultimately does work, and we are trying to build in as many practices as possible to elevate the service.
Yeah, Dean, I think that, well, one thing that is different is that this is not keeping spermatozoa in seminal plasma, which we know is not a good idea, even at room temperature. You know, you're using an extender fluid and quite a bit of it. And I think that's probably one of the main reasons why this works differently, because somebody here said, well, what about the WHO criteria, which says you need to process a semen sample before 45 to 60 minutes. I mean, that's a requirement. Well, but that's probably temperature related to keeping it in an incubator, which a lot of people still do, which probably is not a good idea. But it's all because spermatozoa are in seminal plasma, which is not a transport fluid. It's a, you know, it's not something you use in vitro. You need to get rid of it as soon as possible. I think that's where the differences are.
No, I agree. I'd say that the WHO is based on the fact that it has to be done because of the seminal plasma. Now you don't have the seminal plasma. It's not addressed by WHO because it's not been out there, or at least not in the mainstream. And we did, I mean, we saw a reduction in motility, but it was still predictive of, you know, it didn't like reduce them from being really good to nothing. It was within a band. So, you know, it's a compromise in that sense. But when we look at our semen analysis, we know it's a relatively blunt instrument for diagnosing fertility.
Sure. Yeah. There's a question here from Diego Escura. Diego, hi. And it's a question for Kevin, for your first presentation, Kevin. When you discuss affordability is to run a treatment, but not about the cost to have a baby, which is completely different, right? So how does, I mean, you would need a lot of data, I guess, which is not necessarily available from country to country.
Right. So affordability is important, but yeah, the point's well taken. If you offer an IVF treatment that's affordable but not successful, then you haven't gained a whole lot, and that's where the concept of value comes in, where you're trying to balance the affordability and the successful outcomes.
And Diego is also asking a question of Jan Gerris, which is, can the probe be able to automatically scan the ovary?
Well, that's a very good idea from that gentleman. And the answer is that probably it can be combined with volumetric automatized measurements, but then you are at the very high end spectrum of IVF, whereas our solution really focuses on the very low end of patients who have no access to treatment.
Right. But Diego always has good ideas, so.
Yes.
And again, Jan, for you, differences were found between patients with previous IVF cycles. Do they do better and enjoy this better, or they're used to the conventional method?
Well, we recorded the patient-reported outcomes in all the patients who were in the study. It's about 16 each arm, but in the traditional arm, 39 patients had already a previous IVF cycle. And they were able to compare their experience. And one of the slides, but there were technical hiccups for which I apologize once more, but one of the slides showed you that all the patient-reported outcomes were very significantly in favor of the home sonography. So all the patients favored to do the sonograms themselves. And except for a couple of them, most requested to use the system again, either for a next attempt if they were not pregnant, or if they came back for a second or third child, they requested to use the system again.
Yeah. There are quite a few questions here about costs, Jan.
Yes.
So are you going to, is this company, are they selling the entire kit, or are they going to choose or basically lease those kits, or
Well, I'll give you a Jesuit answer in the sense that it depends on the business model that the center that will use the system would like to apply. There is no business from the company to patients. It's always from the company to a center for reproductive medicine or a hospital or a private practice. And then it's up to those who run the practice to determine in their price structure what they will charge for it. But as orienting data, I can tell you that one system costs about 3,500 euros. And in my hospital, we created a refund dummy score, as it is called, of 400 euros per attempt, which is very low actually. But okay, we are in Western Europe, in Belgium, and indeed, Kevin, one cycle costs for the patients no more than 300 to 400 euros actually. The total cost is 10 times that, but that's still not comparable with American or other countries. This is not the place to make that comparison. It's too society bound. But the patient pay about 400 euros, which makes up for the cost of transportation if they use the traditional system. But it could be, you could also conceive of a system where the center that applies it does not buy suitcases, but just rents them from the company like a solution. Like we had the HRF, pulsatile HRF use in the previously, now it doesn't exist anymore. But the company gives you the system for the time being. All that depends on what contract you make with the company that delivers the system.
Right, right. Well, I think we're running to 4:30 here, which is means 1.5 hours into it. So Dean, maybe you'd like to wrap it up.
I'll bring it home. All right. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time to participate in this session and this really stimulating discussion. We particularly like to thank the 3 speakers again, as well as I'd like to thank my co-moderator, Jacques Cohen from I3. Thank you to the organizing committee of this initiative, Dr. Peter Naj, Thomas Elliott, Shaista Shaduden, Marianne Skivit. I didn't get it that time. There's a tremendous amount of work that goes on behind the scenes to pull this off. None of these individuals are slowing down during this international break-in activity. And I mean, it's amazing how busy we can be when we're not actually that busy in our clinics. So thank you all for the huge amount of time you spend on this endeavor. I would like to encourage you all in the audience to contact I3 if you would like to help create or submit some website content through our website, or if you have ideas about partnership. So far, over 15 embryology and science organizations have pledged their support. And please join us on Tuesday, same bat time, same bat channel for session 13, which will be the CRV abstract session on Tuesday, May 12th. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.